it's extremely rare that on any given day, all three line mates from the same line, same team, all are the three most added players on Yahoo. Doesn't happen very often. And yet the trio of Brassard, Anthony Beauvillier, and Brock Nelson have achieved that, which is just madness. I think it's a little bit sustainable. There's actually some truth to it. Now, I do think you need to adjust your expectations. We talked about them on the week preview, but you need to adjust your expectations a little bit for what they're going to do. But there is something real to this line. So let's start. I mean, I don't think I need to talk about deployment very much, but let's take a look at what's happening here. That second line, Anthony Beauvillier, Brock Nelson, and Derick Brassard, of course, according to Corsica, the fifth best second line in the league at the moment. And they're all on the top power play as well. So they get to take all that chemistry and apply that to the top power play as well. And if we take a look at the last three games, they have been the most frequent line, although it's kind of a 1A, 1B situation with the Barzal, Eberle, and Anders Lee line. So they're pretty similar in terms of time. What's actually really interesting is over the last three games, the Corsi 4 percentage for the Barzal line has been significantly higher at 63.5% versus the Beauvillier, Brassard, and Brock Nelson line, which is 39.6% Corsi 4 percentage. And then, of course, they see the most time on the power play at 54% of the time. They're pretty efficient on the power play as well. From a production standpoint, the Beauvillier, Brassard, and Nelson line actually own the most points at 5-on-5 for the Islanders. The second best is Bailey, Barzal, and Lee with 11 points. And then after that is Lee, Eberle, and Barzal with 6 points. So they're quite better than everybody else with 15 points. So they've easily been the best line. But let's take a look at them individually from a fantasy perspective, because I think there is an order here of who is most sustainable and most likely to keep this deployment. So let's start first with Derick Brassard here. I have them all up on this screen because I think it's important to look at all of them together. Let's take a look at first Derick Brassard here. So his average time on ice has gone up from last year, but not by much, not as much as you'd expect. So over the season, he's at almost 16 minutes a game. Last year, he was at a solid 15 minutes per game, and he was in Ottawa last year. Over the last 7 days, though, it's jumped up to around 18 minutes a game, and over the last 30 days, it's actually 17 minutes a game. So his time on ice has started to increase over these last few games. Not so much on the season as a whole, but when you look at these last few games, it has been a significant jump in ice time, and that's really important to remember, and that's actually a really good thing for Derick Brassard. Now, when we look at his shooting percentage, his shot pace, by the way, has gone up, but it's nothing to boast about. It's only 144 shot pace, 171 over his last 30 games, but his shooting percentage is what's a little high. So it's at 16% on the season. Over the last 30 days, it's 17%. Not that big of a difference, but enough that it's noticeable. He did shoot at around 13% last year. So you would expect it to be a little bit of a high shooting percentage. He is a high shooting percentage player, but 16% is just too high. But again, that's the difference of, we're talking probably like 1 or 2 goals. So it's not that big of a deal at the moment, but it does affect how his line mates get assists. That's why these high shooting percentages are going to be important. Now, his IPP is fine. It's high, but he's on a good line that's playing really well. On ice shooting percentage of 11%, 12% is fine. I would actually expect it to be a little bit lower. The Isles as a whole at 5-on-5, while Derick Brassard, Brock Nelson, and Anthony Beauvillier are not on the ice, is 9.7% of on-ice shooting percentage. So remember that when we're talking about the on-ice shooting percentage of these folks, is that when they're not on the ice, it's around 9.2-ish%, 9.7% rather. Derick Brassard's IPP is kind of right in line, 72%, 73% on the season, 76% over the last 30 days, and 60% over the last 3 games. So he's been really good and factored into almost all the points that have happened while he's been on the ice. So he's been really good. And actually, I think that he's pretty sustainable from everything I see. I think what's not sustainable is the assists should come down in general. And as we'll see, the reason that that's going to happen is because Derick Brassard, Brock Nelson, and Anthony Beauvillier all feature pretty high shooting percentages over these last 30 days, 7 days. So if you look at the on-ice shooting percentage for Derick Brassard over the last 7 days, it's 17%. Over the last 16 days, it's 15%. And so the assists should come down quite a bit when that on-ice shooting percentage also gets deflated a little bit. So Derick Brassard, to me, is, of these people, the second most sustainable of them all. The most sustainable to me is Brock Nelson, who's seen his minutes climb a lot from last season. So last year, he was around 18 minutes. of average time on ice. This year on the season, he's at 19, but over his last 11 games, last 30 days, he's sitting at 19 minutes of average time on ice, and over the last 3 games, it's jumped up to 20 minutes per game. So that's a huge increase. That's 2 whole minutes of ice time per game, and he's taking advantage of that. His shot pace is up 42% on the season. Insane. And that's amazing. That's exactly like what you dream of for a fantasy guy, right? Someone shooting that much. Over the last 11 games, his shot pace is 276. Over the last 7 days, it's 437. That is awesome from Brock Nelson. I love to see that. And from a shooting percentage perspective, it's actually pretty sustainable. Over the season, it's 12%. Over the last 30 days or 11 games, 10%, 11%. That's great. That's totally sustainable for a guy like Brock Nelson, who last year shot at 14%. Over the last 3 games, it has been high, 25%. He scored 4 goals, expected 2, but not too bad. So again, 25% over these last 3 games, but over the season, he's been shooting well too. So as long as that shot pace keeps up, you can expect a decent number of goals from Brock Nelson. Right now, his expected goals for is just around 8, and he has 8 goals. So he's doing as well as you'd expect at the moment, which is a really, really good sign. Now, I should note that is on the season. Now, his IPP is right in line with last year. Last year's IPP was 72%. This year, it's 70%. Great stuff out of him again, being consistent. He is pretty much playing like he did last year, but with a massive increase in shots. That's the big difference maker here, is the increase in shots. And as we'll see right now too, is the increase in power play percentage or power play time on ice over these last few games that has also helped a lot. Now, the on ice shooting percentage over the last 3 games has been really high at 19%. So that's one thing, again, similar to Brassard in that you'd expect that on ice shooting percentage to come down a little bit, but on the season and over the last 30 days, Brock Nelson's on ice shooting percentage has actually been really sustainable. So I wouldn't worry too much about these last 3 games being unsustainable. It's really the last 30 days and the whole season that has been really, really good to him. And other than that, like he looks really good. His hits pace is up a little bit. His blocks pace is up a little bit, not by much. Getting some faceoff wins, if that matters for you. His faceoff win pace is actually up 25% from last year. So that's really, really good for him. And it's pretty interesting because you can have Brock Nelson or Derick Brassard take faceoffs, which actually adds a little bit of something interesting to that line. So Brock Nelson, to me, is the most sustainable of all these 3 guys. Now, I'll get into their actual point paces and what I expect for them at the very end. But first, I just want to kind of go through each of them and give you what I think is sustainable or not sustainable to each. And so Anthony Beauvillier is the next one here. He has seen the biggest increase in time on ice of all 3 of them. So he went from seeing around 15 minutes a game last year to on the season, and this is on the season, his deployment is at around 18 minutes a game. That's huge. That's a big deal. It's 3 whole minutes for him. So he's consistently been a guy that across the whole season has seen really good deployment. You've seen him play with Barzell, and they've put him on pretty good lines. So from last year to this year, the person that I think has seen the biggest improvement from a deployment perspective of these 3 is Anthony Beauvillier. Brock Nelson is getting a better deployment, but not so much from a time on ice perspective. Time on ice has kind of been about the same as last year. But Anthony Beauvillier has seen a huge increase. Again, 15 minutes last year. On the season, he's sitting at 18 minutes. Over the last 30 days, 18 minutes still, but it's over these last 7 days, over these last 3 games that he's seen his minutes jump up a ton, and they're up to 21 whole minutes. That's massive for a player like him. The disappointing thing there is that the shots aren't as big as I'd expect. Last year's on a 158 shot pace. This year, he's on only a 184 shot pace. It has increased over the last 30 days. So over the last 11 games, he's on a 224 shot pace. So that's a good thing. He has been increasing his shot pace as the season goes on, as you kind of dissect it down from, okay, what is the first 10 games, and now what are these last 11 games? How does that look? And as you get more deeper into the season, you want to see the shot pace continue to increase or stay high. That's a good thing for him. His shooting percentage is the most unsustainable of them all. 17% on the season. Over the last 30 days, these last 11 games, his shooting percentage is 20%, which is pretty insane. And over these last 3 games, it's 25%. Last year, he was a 12% shooter. So I do not expect this 20% shooting over these last 11 games to continue. I expect that to come down for sure. And the fact that it's 17% on the season tells me, okay, he's been pretty lucky the whole season. And that's a pretty important thing to note. Now, from an on-ice shooting percentage perspective, he's also been extremely lucky on the season. It's 14.3%. That's really, really high. And again, remember that the Isles, on average, most skaters are around like 9-ish percent, 9.9 to 10%, let's say, right? They're somewhere in there. And for him to be at 14.3 is a big increase from everybody else. So he's benefited from a lot of line mates at different points in the season shooting at very high percentages. And now that he's with Brock Nelson and Derick Brassard, he's benefited even more. Over the last 7 days, it's 18%. So he's benefited a lot over this last stretch. And that's why he's the lowest owned, is because, although I will say that the fact that he's the lowest owned is actually very surprising to me, considering that he actually shoots more than Brassard, has a higher shooting percentage than Brassard, and has a higher on-ice shooting percentage than Brassard. It dictates that he actually has the most luck at the moment, and is actually the hotter hand than Derick Brassard. But he's also, to me, the most unsustainable at the moment. The team power play percentage and actually time on ice for Anthony Beauvillier has increased a ton, which is a really good thing to see. And his power play shooting percentage has increased a lot. Last year, he shot at only 5% on the power play. This year, he's shooting at 22% so far. So what about their actual, what's to be expected of their point totals? Now, for Derick Brassard, I'd say that I would expect him to be probably like a 55 to 60-ish point guy, with probably 65 as his ceiling. And the reason I say that is again, remember that these are not because they're indictments on the player as a whole. On the season so far, he's at a 62-point pace right now on the season. And that's with a 16% shooting percentage and an on-ice shooting percentage of 11.8%. So I'm assuming the assists stay about the same, but his goal production comes down a little bit. So you're looking at probably like a 60-point guy, right, with a 65-point ceiling. Now, of course, things could change, but I can't use, or I wouldn't use these last 30 days or last 7 days to judge who Derick Brassard is and who he will be, simply because his on-ice shooting percentage and shooting percentages are higher. If you look at the more sustainable whole season outlook of Derick Brassard, I think that's a more reasonable outlook for what to expect from points from him. That still actually makes him pretty valuable, especially when he may have stretches that he gets these crazy point totals that he is right now. So he's definitely worth owning right now. Now, Brock Nelson, to me, is the guy who's absolutely should be owned. He's the one, to me, who's the most sustainable, and on top of that has the highest points total of probably a 70-point guy. I mean, if you look at it right now from a season standpoint, he's a sustainable. I mean, I'd expect less assists because his on-ice shooting percentage is 13%. That's pretty high, so I'd expect that to come down a little bit. But his goals should actually probably go up because he's shooting more as of late, and his shooting percentage has actually been pretty sustainable across the season. And so I'd expect his goals to go up significantly from last year. You're probably looking at potentially a 30-goal scorer this year in Brock Nelson. And if he can get a few line mates that are hot and get a little bit lucky with the on-ice shooting percentage, which I could see happening, I could see him ending, an 11 to 12% on-ice shooter if he gets lucky on the power play and at even strength. You're looking at a decent number of assists as well. Not that big of a decrease from his current season long on-ice shooting percentage of 13%. So I'd expect Brock Nelson to be a potentially 70 to 75-point guy with maybe point per game potential if things go really, really right for him. So I'd absolutely add Brock Nelson. Anthony Beauvillier is the one that's a little bit more questionable for me. The shots are good. They're much better than Derick Brassard, but he's being bolstered a ton by a pretty ridiculous on-ice shooting percentage and shooting percentage. To me, he's the most hot hand type. The guy that I'd grab and be very quick to drop as soon as things start to fall off a cliff. But that being said, even there, I see probably like a 50 to 55-point guy. So if you're in a very deep league, that's enticing. That's really good. So with all of these guys, they're all worth owning in some capacity. I think Brock Nelson is the most long-term, Derick Brassard the next most long-term ad after him, and then there's Anthony Beauvillier, who's a hot hand and really good to own for now and potentially in a deep league worth owning while this line is so hot. But to me, Brock Nelson is the guy that it could have a huge breakout season this year if he continues playing the way he's playing. And really what you're looking at is it doesn't even have to continue playing the way he's playing. It's just keep shooting the way you're shooting, Brock Nelson. And even if you hit last year's shooting percentage, which he's down from last year's shooting percentage, if he hits that shooting percentage, you're looking again at probably a 30-goal guy, above 30-goal guy. And if he can continue to have line mates that are hot, which the Isles are playing extremely well, so whether you play Brock Nelson with Barzell or you play him with Derick Brassard, it doesn't really matter. he's doing really well regardless. So Brock Nelson is the most to me. And then there's Derick Brassard, who's just actually been very, very good for that line and has meshed very well. And then there's Anthony Beauvillier, who I think is the odd one out in terms of who do you move off at some point. Even though he's gotten really good deployment this year, he's the one that I could see being shuffled if something kind of slows down. But either way, I like them all a lot. I don't think I'd say either. I'd say Brock Nelson is the most must add or go get him right now, soon sort of guy. But then I'd look at Anthony Beauvillier as the least and Derick Brassard in the middle. So go grab your aisles while you can, especially Brock Nelson. Have a great day. Pay attention to Unsustainable Wednesdays tomorrow, and I'll catch you next time.